My name is Jonathan. I am now an adult, but one story from my childhood still haunts me. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York. Our house stood in a quiet suburb where all the neighbors knew each other, and most of them were our friends. I was 15 years old at the time, and often stayed home alone when my parents were away on business. I always considered myself responsible and mature enough to be on my own. But one day I realized that it's not that simple. It happened one summer. My parents had gone to a business meeting in another city and were not expected back until the next day. That evening I decided to spend my time at home, preparing dinner and watching old horror movies. I always liked such films because they reminded me that life could be much scarier than fictional stories. But that night, fear became a reality. Around midnight, I heard the first sounds. It was like a faint rustling on the floor. At first, I thought it was just the old house making noises again, but the sound repeated, and it became clearer. It was like someone was carefully walking down the corridor. I turned off the TV and listened. My heart started beating faster, and I felt cold sweat running down my back. Maybe it's just the wind, I thought, but there was no wind. Outside, it was a quiet, calm night. I decided to check. I took a kitchen knife for self-defense and cautiously walked toward the source of the sound. The hallway was dark. Only the moonlight was penetrating through the window, casting eerie shadows on the walls. When I reached the end of the hallway, the sound suddenly stopped. I opened my parents' bedroom door, empty. Then I peeked into my room, also nothing. Feeling relieved, I thought it was all just a trick of my imagination. I returned to the kitchen, put the knife back in its place, and decided to drink some water. But when I opened the refrigerator, I heard a faint whisper. It was like someone was standing next to me and speaking softly. I froze. Hundreds of thoughts were spinning in my head. Could it be the TV again? But no, it was off. I began to cautiously look around. In the darkness, something moved. The sound became louder. I realized it was coming from the basement. I wasn't afraid of that place before, but that night everything changed. The basement seemed to me like a bottomless dark pit full of secrets and fears. Gathering all my courage, I took a flashlight and went to the basement. The steps creaked under my feet, creating an even more eerie atmosphere. When I reached the bottom, opened the basement door, and directed the flashlight beam into the darkness, I saw something that made me freeze in horror. In the corner of the basement, among old boxes and junk, stood a figure. It was a man, his face half hidden in the shadow. He stood motionless, but his eyes glowed in the dark, staring straight at me. I screamed and rushed upstairs, forgetting about the knife, about everything in the world. I ran into my room and locked the door, trying not to make a sound. My heart was pounding wildly, and I started calling the police. The dispatcher said a patrol would arrive in a few minutes. Those minutes seemed like an eternity to me. I sat in the corner of my room, trembling with fear. I heard the sounds in the house again, footsteps, rustling, whispering. But I had no intention of leaving my hiding place. Finally, I heard police sirens and saw blue and red lights reflecting on the walls. The police quickly broke into the house and found me. They thoroughly searched the basement and the entire house, but found no one. No signs of entry, no evidence that anyone had been in the house. They told me it might have been just a nervous breakdown or hallucination from watching horror movies. But I know what I saw. That figure in the basement, its piercing gaze, the fear I felt, all of it was real. After that night, I couldn't stay home alone for a long time. Every rustle, every sound made me nervous and look around. Years have passed, but the memories of that night still haunt me. I realized that sometimes the scariest things don't happen in movies, but in real life, and they can catch us where we least expect it. Friends, thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, like, and leave a comment. What story scared you the most? Let's discuss. And now, let's move on to the next story. My name is Tom, and today I want to tell you a story from my childhood that happened when I was only 10 years old. I lived in a small town in the USA. It was a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other, and no one ever expected any trouble. But sometimes, even in the safest places, things can happen that scare you to death. It happened one summer evening. My parents decided to go out to dinner with friends and left me home alone. I was very happy because it meant I could play video games as much as I wanted and have pizza for dinner. I started my evening by watching TV and then decided to check the fridge for something tasty. Feeling hungry, I found some leftover pizza and returned to the living room. As I walked down the hallway, I heard a strange noise, like a door creaking. I dismissed it as the old house's usual sounds. It always made weird noises. Sitting on the couch and playing my favorite game, I noticed our dog, a golden retriever named Buck, behaving strangely. He stood by the window growling, staring into the darkness. I tried to calm him down, but he ignored me. After a while, I heard the basement door creak open. That was odd because I distinctly remembered it being closed. I decided to check, but when I reached the door, it was closed again. Maybe it was just my imagination. Returning to my game, I heard the creak again, but this time it was louder. My skin crawled with goosebumps, and I felt my heart start to race. I decided to turn off the TV and listen. Silence. Maybe it was all in my head. Around 9 in the evening, I went to my room to get a book I was assigned for summer reading. Passing by the window, I noticed a movement out of the corner of my eye. There, in the dark, was a figure standing under the streetlight, staring at my house. I froze in fear, trying to figure out if it was a neighbor or a complete stranger. I quietly moved away from the window and closed the curtains. The thought of calling my parents crossed my mind, but I decided I didn't want to scare them. Maybe it was just someone passing by our house. I tried to focus on my book, but my thoughts kept returning to that figure outside. Suddenly, I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. Someone was coming up to the second floor. I froze in fear. There shouldn't be anyone in the house except me and Buck. Gathering my thoughts, I grabbed the baseball bat that was under my bed and cautiously stepped out of my room. The footsteps grew louder, and I realized someone was approaching my room. Stopping by the door, I heard the doorknob slowly begin to turn. I yanked the door open, ready for the worst. In front of me stood a man dressed in black with a mask on his face. He looked like he had stepped out of my worst nightmares. I couldn't move, and Buck started growling and jumping at the man. The intruder pushed Buck away and advanced toward me. I had no choice but to try to defend myself. I swung the bat and hit him on the arm. He screamed in pain and paused for a moment, giving me a chance to run out of the room. I ran to the phone, trying to call the police, but the man caught up with me and knocked the phone out of my hands. I felt his grip on my shoulder as he threw me to the floor, my vision blurred from fear and pain. Buck attacked the intruder again, giving me a chance to get up and run out of the house. I screamed, hoping one of the neighbors would hear me. I ran to Mrs. Smith's house, our neighbor, and started banging on the door. She opened it, and I ran inside, trembling with fear and crying. The police arrived quickly. They searched our house and found the man trying to escape through the back door. It turned out he was a burglar who had been on the run for a long time. They arrested him, and I returned home with my parents. That night left a permanent mark on my life. I never stayed home alone again, and our house was equipped with new security systems. Now, when I think back on those events, I still get chills from fear. But I also understand that it was that night when I learned to be brave and protect myself. Yes, this was a scary story from my childhood. And even though I am now an adult, those memories still live in my mind. Always remember, even in the safest places, the scariest things can happen. My name is Jonathan Miller, and I will always remember that terrifying evening when I was 10 years old. It was an ordinary summer day in a small town in Pennsylvania, where I lived with my parents in an old but cozy house on the outskirts of town. That day, my mom and dad decided to go to a party at a friend's house, leaving me home alone. They knew I was old enough to stay by myself, and I felt confident, ready for the new responsibility. I was even excited about the chance to spend the evening alone, playing video games and watching horror movies. After my parents left, I locked the doors and turned on the TV in the living room. The evening was quiet and peaceful, and I quickly immersed myself in the game, but soon I felt a strange sensation, as if someone was watching me. I looked around, but the house was empty. It must be just my imagination, I reassured myself. After a while, I heard a strange sound coming from the basement. It was a quiet but distinct creak, as if something was moving in the darkness. My heart started to beat faster, and I decided to check it out. I took a flashlight and headed to the basement. The stairs creaked under my feet, and each step seemed heavier than the last. When I opened the basement door, darkness greeted me. I turned on the flashlight and cautiously descended. The basement was cold and damp, but I didn't notice anything unusual. It must have been the wind, I thought, returning to the living room. A few more hours passed, and I began to feel tired. I decided to go to bed, but before turning off the TV, I heard the strange sound again, this time from the attic. My heart trembled in my chest, and I decided to check it out once more. I grabbed the same flashlight and carefully made my way to the attic. The attic door was heavy, and when I opened it, it let out a loud creak. I turned on the flashlight and cautiously climbed up. In the corner of the attic, I saw something that made me freeze in fear. There stood a stranger in old, tattered clothes, with mad eyes glowing in the darkness. I took a step back, but the man started moving toward me. He was whispering something unintelligible, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I dashed toward the stairs, trying to escape, but the man was faster. He grabbed my arm, and I felt the cold touch of his fingers. "Let me go," I screamed, trying to break free. But his grip was strong. I tried to remember all the self-defense lessons my parents had taught me, but fear paralyzed me. Suddenly, I remembered the phone in my room. I wrenched my arm free and ran for the door, trying to escape. As I ran down the stairs, I could hear his footsteps behind me. He didn't stop, and his breath was getting closer. I barely made it to my room, slammed the door shut, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911. "Help! Someone is in my house! He's chasing me!" I shouted into the receiver. The operator tried to calm me down and said that the police were on their way. Time seemed to drag on endlessly. Sitting under the bed, I could hear the man approaching my door. He knocked and whispered my name. Soon I heard police sirens. The door to my room burst open, and the stranger vanished, leaving me alone and terrified. The police entered the house, and I rushed out of my hiding spot, running to them. "He was here! I saw him!" I cried, trying to explain the situation. The police searched the entire house but found no trace of the intruder. They reassured me and stayed until my parents arrived. When my parents returned, I told them everything that had happened. They were shocked and decided we needed to move. We soon sold the house and relocated to another town. But I never forgot that night and the fear I felt. It was my last night in that house, and since then, I have never stayed home alone again. My childhood sense of security was shattered forever, leaving me only with memories of that terrifying evening. Years passed and I grew older, but I couldn't forget that night. I often woke up from nightmares where the stranger was chasing me again. I could feel his cold fingers gripping me and hear his whispers in the dark. My family tried to comfort me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there somewhere. One day when I was 16, I decided to return to that old house. I needed to understand what had happened that night and put an end to my fears. I asked one of my friends to come with me, and we set off for the place where my home once stood. The house stood abandoned, its windows boarded up, and the yard overgrown with weeds. We entered, and memories flooded back. Every corner, every room reminded me of that terrifying night. We climbed up to the attic, and I felt that cold fear again. My friend tried to cheer me up, but suddenly we heard a strange sound, the same creak I had heard many years ago. We turned and saw a shadow in the corner of the room. My heart started pounding, and I felt the fear grip me once more. The shadow began to move, and I saw those same mad eyes glowing in the darkness. My friend bolted for the door, but I stood frozen, unable to move. The shadow came closer, and I felt those cold fingers touch me again. "You can't escape from me," the man whispered, and I realized that this was not just a dream. He was real, and he had come for me. I mustered all my courage and dashed for the door, grabbing my friend's hand. We ran out of the house and never looked back. That encounter left me with new fears, but also with the understanding that I could no longer hide. I had to overcome this fear and move on. And although the shadow of that man will always remain in my memory, I will never again let fear control my life. This story became a part of me, and I will always remember that evening when I was home alone,